Okay, here we are. We're back, and so are you. And if you're not back and you're here for the first time, welcome. And welcome to everybody else who is here.
Mm-hmm.
So today, we are going to be talking about what we consider to be one of the essential aspects of all healthy relationships. And it has to do with trust, which probably isn't a surprise to most of you. So the dictionary defines trust as a firm reliance on the ability, the character, or the integrity of a person or thing. So we are going to be looking at a particular person in terms of the question of trust. And that person is you. We're talking about self-trust today. And self-trust is really essential in order to have trust in a relationship. And one of the things that a lot of us tend to do is when we think about trust, we think about trusting other people. And when you think about it, you really have to be able to trust yourself in order to know who it is that's trustworthy out there. Because if you don't trust your own judgment, then you may not feel that you can depend upon what you think is trustworthy in other people. So this really is the foundation, self-trust. And it's not something that we're necessarily born with. We'll be talking about that a little bit later, but we are born with a tendency to favor what feels good. And cultivating self-trust often can be more challenging than simply going after what feels good. So what we're talking about when we talk about cultivating self-trust is what feels right and making that distinction. So that's a couple of the things that we're going to be talking about today.
Mm-hmm. So often we find when people are thinking about what would enlarge their relationship, expand their relationship, deepen their relationship, strengthen it, self-trust isn't necessarily one of the things that comes up for them. And what we have found for our own relationship and with the many couples that we've worked with over the decades that we've been doing couple work and consulting is that when people dedicate themselves to developing their own self-trust, their relationships move, usually in a very positive direction. That when people are more self-trusting, have that firm reliance on the integrity of themselves, it invites trust of other. When we have that firm reliance on the integrity of ourself, we're good with drawing boundaries. We become better at asking for what we need. We're more self-referential, meaning that we turn to our own self to find out what it is we're feeling, what it is we're needing, what our vision for our life is, what our own work is. And our attention isn't focused so much on the other person. It locates the power and influence inside ourselves. But there's some dues that has to be paid to become self-trusting, to become self-reliant, self-referential. And one of the things that's necessary is to unhook from excessive approval from other people. So instead of scanning of what do they want from me and trying to live up to some supposed expectations or literally announced expectations of the other person, that we see what is true for us and to have the courage to be able to speak that truth and live out of that truth, even though it may create some friction with the person that we're in relationship with, because it might not be their preference. these couples who both have been doing their work to become more self-trusting, they haven't given up parts of themselves, parts of their beliefs, part of their vision for their life, their way of being. They just made a big space for the two ways of being to peacefully coexist. And that's really getting into the higher realms of well-being, of relationship. And it's a lot of work for some of us who have been very concerned about approval from others to reverse that process and stop scanning so much from what other people want from us, and to look to ourselves about what I want, to be that self-respecting and feel that much self-worth that we turn to ourselves to see what is it that is my value, what is it that is my preference, what is it that is my truth.
Yeah, so that really speaks to the importance of the I word in trust. And the I word, as in the letter I, is integrity.
Mm-hmm.
That when we are willing to compromise or give away or sacrifice parts of ourself for the sake of approval from other people, then we're actually diminishing our sense of integrity. Integrity really means wholeness. It comes from the root of the word is integer, and integer is a whole number. It's something that's complete. It's whole in and of itself. When we break off parts of ourself because we feel the need for external approval, then we diminish our sense of wholeness and integrity. We also diminish our ability to access resources within ourself that can be helpful to give us that feeling of wholeness. And that wholeness doesn't mean that we don't need anybody. It doesn't mean that we're not interdependent with other people. It just means that we have a full, wide, and deep range of resources within ourselves to help us to operate more autonomously in our lives. And that means that, we can be interdependent with other people. That is, that we share mutually support. It goes both ways. Human beings are social creatures, and we all need to provide support, which provides us with a sense of wholeness and self-worth, and to receive it too. And so we're talking about what it means and how we can deepen our sense of self-trust, which simultaneously, when we do that, we actually become less dependent upon the approval of other people. Their approval isn't as important. That doesn't mean that we don't want to have relationships with them. It doesn't mean that we don't have other needs that can get filled in the context of that relationship. But the more we can cultivate self-trust, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we can do that today, the more we're going to be able to have confidence in our own inner resources.
The how-to part comes when people see their own longing and their own yearning to have a great relationship and how they can influence that. So if we start to connect the dots and see that if I'm doing my own work and developing my self-trust, and you're doing your own work and you're developing your own self-trust, that we are going to rise together in our cooperation and our collaboration and our co-creation. And so the one thing that comes to mind, in addition to unhooking from approval from others, is to live in the now. Because when people are busy with preoccupied thoughts about things they've done that have been unskillful choices they made, mistakes they made, failures that they've had, they're living in the past. And it keeps people from really trusting that they've learned from their past. So examine wherever you feel you've made unskillful choices without the recrimination. I'm very fascinated by the crime is a part of that word, that we hold ourselves without mercy, that we've done something really often awful and unforgivable, that it's a crime. We all make mistakes as we are learning. We all have learning experiences, and to mind them, to learn from them, and to be conscious about letting go and not let our inner critic beat us up about things that we've done in the past. We have to talk back to that bully. By the same token, practicing mindfulness, being present in the moment, will keep us from being worrier about anticipating all awful things can happen in the future. And if I don't scan for what everybody wants from me, I'm going to be all alone and blah, blah. These scary thoughts, also coming from the inner critic, can keep us from being present in the moment, where we know what we're experiencing, we know what we want, we know what we need, we know what we feel, we know what our truth is. And so this is one of the direct paths to become more self-trusting, is living in the now and disciplining our mind so that we're not siphoning off and using up energy uselessly with the past and the future.
Yeah, there just isn't any way, like I said earlier, it doesn't come naturally to have a high level of self-trust. We have to earn it. And there isn't any way to earn it without learning. We have to be willing to self-reflect and learn from our experiences, to notice that when I did that, there was a certain consequence that was either reaffirming my wholeness, my integrity, or something else. Maybe it was diminishing it. But there's a relationship between certain behaviors and actions and then the results. And if we can look at that, and this is the tough part, to look at it without judgment, without self-judgment, without punishing ourselves, or responding to what you're talking about with the inner critic.
Right.
Without shaming ourselves, without blaming ourselves, without making ourselves wrong, without saying mean or hurtful things to us, that doesn't enhance our ability to learn, and it doesn't enhance our self-trust. It does the opposite. So learning and self-trust cannot take place in an inner environment within our own consciousness that is punitive, in which we are inflicting emotional or mental suffering on ourselves, in which we are feeling and indulging in punitive feelings and accusations and judgment that are really causing us suffering. So suffering and learning don't really go real well together. And yet many of us, maybe most of us, have learned to associate inflicting pain with the learning process. And it goes back to all kinds of experiences that we might have had in our families or in our schools or other institutions. I mean, how many of us heard the phrase, I'm going to teach you a lesson? That doesn't mean that's not good news. That's not something that any of us would really respond to with a favorable feeling. So to be conscious of how we are responding to the results of what we're doing. If we're doing something and it has a certain outcome that we consider favorable, then we might, want to acknowledge that and, see what there is for me to learn from that can enhance my ability to, in the future, respond in similar ways. If the outcome, on the other hand, is not something that is favorable in terms of my own intention and the achievement of my goal, then can I look at that with the question, so what is it that I can learn from this experience, as opposed to, just projecting all kinds of punitive thoughts on myself. You
Mm-hmm.
stupid. Why didn't, you're never going to learn. You keep making the same mistake. Most lessons actually require making more than one mistake.
And that's locating the power with each of us as an individual.
That's right.
Rather than feeling that it's out there.
Yeah.
That the world is a dangerous place and that it's full of people who are out to take advantage and exploit and that aren't caring. When we start noticing that we've got thoughts like that, a little bit paranoid thoughts, at least suspicious thoughts, this whole notion of I don't trust you or I don't trust, projecting it out there and really taking that back about, could this have something to do with me? Could this have something to do with the unhealed places in me? Could this have something to do, not that it isn't true out there, but it takes the emphasis from out there about people being untrustworthy and dangerous and locating where the power is.
I want to respond to that about people, the generic people, or
our specific partner, maybe,
or women. Well, women are blank,
or men are blank, a bunch of babies. They just offer themselves.
Whatever generalizations we make those generalizations because they're convenient, and it enables us to kind of go back to sleep and put people in a category rather than showing up and looking at each individual on the basis of who they are, without bringing those overly generalizations into our consciousness, and recognizing when we start making those generalizations to correct ourselves and realize that some people are like that, some men are like that, a lot of women maybe are like that,
and
whatever it is, but there's always exceptions,
right?
And when we buy into some of those gross generalizations, which we kind of fabricate because there's a lot of cultural agreement with that, and it's also easier to just kind of discount half the population or a certain group of people than it is to kind of have to show up and take every person on the basis of their own essential being.
And where the rubber meets the road with this is the people that we're closest to.
Yeah.
And if we notice that we're having some trust issues, it can be so obvious to us at first glance that it's about them and their trustworthiness.
Yeah.
And it's a disempowered position to be in to keep that folklore going.
Yeah.
And that if we come back to the self to look to see if we might have something to do with it. And I'm remembering somebody that I worked with some years ago who was in relationship with a woman, and she was very anxious to get married. And he wasn't ready. I'm calling him Bob and Valerie. And she said, you've known me for 2 years and you know me well enough. I want to get married. I will get married now. And he wasn't ready. And he didn't like being talked to in such a demanding and commanding way.
Can't understand why.
When he really took a look about his reluctance to get married to her, the story that he first told me was, oh, she's not as attractive to me. So other women that I've been with are so much more sexually attractive, and she's not. And I don't think I want to be tied down to somebody that I'm not that turned on to. But I pressed him and had him look a little bit more closely, and he said, man, I've got months and months of accumulated resentment here. I haven't been telling her. I haven't been drawing boundaries with her when she's got tone in her voice, and I haven't been giving her feedback when she's demanding and when about marriage or anything else. She's got a whole lot of things that she comes on really strong about. And I said, well, before you give up on this relationship and let her go, see what happens. We start being more honest with her. Trust yourself. Trust the discomfort that you feel when you're being treated this way. And he started telling her that it's not okay for me to treat you that way. And lo and behold, he finds out that he's pretty turned on to her after all. And she did put some corrections in. Now I'm condensing what happened over a period of many months.
Right.
But
Right.
those two ended up getting married.
But you're making a really important point here, and that is that in the process of building self-trust, you've got to be willing to take risks. You don't get there without taking certain risks. So when you're honest with yourself, you're going to be more honest with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And when you stop making rationalizations and excuses to yourself to justify certain things that are going on or that you're doing or that they're doing in order to avoid conflict or in order to avoid being more vulnerable, then you're much more likely to be violating your own integrity. And integrity is really living in congruence with your fundamental values.
Mm-hmm.
It's when there's an alignment in your behavior with what is right for you, with what is uniquely who you are, and you're acting in accordance with that. You're speaking the truth about that. And that always involves some kind of risk. The
Mm-hmm.
reason that we go up, that we cultivate these images and become dependent upon other people's approval is because we're trying to avoid taking those risks.
Right. And I think this Bob and Valerie story illustrates that point very well.
Yeah.
When he was busy trying to be a pleaser and sucking it up and not telling her the truth about how hurt he was and how offended he was and how resentful,
Yeah.
the relationship was going nowhere
Yeah.
fast.
But she could have responded very differently and said,
No.
you're insulting me, and this is really, I'm not willing to live with somebody or be in relationship with somebody who is mean the way you are. I'm out of here. That was a risk that he had to be willing to
And
take.
he was willing to take it because the relationship was going
sometimes when it gets that broken
nowhere
down,
fast.
you got nothing to lose.
And he took responsibility
Yeah.
for not trusting his own instincts, not trusting his own gut.
Yeah.
And he realized that
How
when
he
he
had been
went back
contributing
to
to that.
childhood and
Yeah.
what a pleaser he tried to be with his mother, and he transferred that onto Valerie, and he saw that he was replaying this old pattern and that he needed to break this whether Valerie walked or not. He was willing to let her go.
That's right.
But that he had to honor himself
for his own
and
benefit,
respect himself.
regardless of where the relationship
He'd
went.
been so busy talking himself out of how he
Right.
felt.
Yeah, that's the
That
rationalization and
when
justification.
When he wasn't attracted to her, he said, "Oh, that's not such an important part of relationship.
Yeah,
I shouldn't
right.
make such a big deal out of it."
Right.
But it was a big deal to him.
Right.
And when she was kind of bitchy to him, he was trying to talk himself out of that too.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, she has the right to express herself. And when he really started to treat himself with more respect, when he started to trust his own inner promptings and worked up the courage to tell her the truth, that's when the relationship changed for the better.
Yeah.
So the self-respect, self-trust stuff really can enhance our relationships. And that's often not the place where people look when they want their relationship to up level and be the best that it could possibly be.
So if you notice that your self-trust has diminished, it's probably, in many cases, that may be linked to your having disrespected or violated your own integrity in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And the repair for that is to be ruthlessly self-reflective and really take a look and see, where in my life have I been out of alignment with my true nature?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any place that I can see I haven't been really honest about who I am, or with other people about where I am? And are there any adjustments that I might need to make in order to realign myself with my deeper values?
That's right, which requires knowing ourselves well.
Exactly.
And owning our golden side, where our signature strengths
the dark
are,
shadow and the bright shadow.
Also our weak suits, and telling the truth about that.
Yeah.
Because we're going to project all that stuff onto the other person.
Mm-hmm.
What Bob ended up telling me at the end when we were terminating the counseling, he said, what I realized is all those times when I was saying inside my own mind, I don't trust her, I don't trust her. I don't trust you, Valerie. That it was really, he was saying, I don't trust me.
I don't trust myself to take care of myself when I'm feeling blamed or attacked or diminished in some way. I don't trust myself to take a stand on my own behalf.
There was the teaching for him. And
Right.
I think that's a profound teaching.
Yeah.
And so if we're noticing that we're feeling distrustful for whatever reasons, there may be a kernel of truth in that about the other person. Our mind may be blowing it out of proportion to the point that it eclipses the part that we're playing in it. And that's where we really have some power and influence. If we can see the complicity of the dance that we're doing that keeps the distrustful pattern going, the excuses, the rationalizations, the stories, talking ourselves out of what is really true for us, that's where we can start to put the skillful choices in that make the positive result.
So like so many other things, it's really quite simple. It's just not easy, because we're dealing with a lot of accumulated patterns and defenses that we have used and we've stood by and have served us over the years. But at some point, we might notice that there's a price that I have been paying to use these patterns of protection or avoidance, and it's no longer, the benefit is no longer overriding the cost. And at that point, we might have some motivation to take some of the risks of living more authentically.
So in my closing remarks, I would like to express gratitude to you for all the good work that you've done over many years to become self-trusting. Because as you have been more self-trusting, that you're going to take care of yourself, you're not going to sell yourself out, you're not going to compromise your own integrity, the trust that you have in me has grown. And I'm thriving because I feel like I get a whole lot of trust and I deserve it, from you. And I hope you feel that way about me as well, that I have been working for a long time not to be a people pleaser and to tell the truth, even if I'm going to get some blowback about it, and to give you feedback when things don't work for me. Yeah. And I've really learned to trust my instincts and to trust my gut and to trust that my values are good ones and my intentions are good ones. And as I've become more self-trusting, I feel like I have a whole lot more trust in you and in the world in general, that it's shaped my worldview, that the world is a basically good place. It's a friendly place, and people
with a few
good.
Exceptions.
Yes, I have to be careful.
Yeah.
But I feel like my bullshit detector's really grown, that I can tell the untrustworthy ones from the trustworthy ones, and I don't have to go around, as paranoid as I used to be in the early years that we were together.
Well, thank you. That feels really good to hear, and feels very validating, and particularly because it hasn't always been this way. So I'm really enjoying this stage of the game where, we both have enhanced levels of trust and respect in each other and in ourselves. And very briefly, because I know we're kind of out of time, but I want to just acknowledge your enhanced level of skill in delivering that feedback in a way that I can hear it.
Right on.
Because as you can recall, when you first started doing it, it was not quite as diplomatic as you've learned to be, and it's much easier to hear it now. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the acknowledgement.
Okay.
I own it. So we want to tell you about next week's topic, and we're speaking about the nuts and bolts that are necessary to have a successful partnership.
Okay.
All right.
Let's go.
We'll see you next week.
Bye.